Hello, my name is Anne Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each episode begins with this one question. Our guests come from all walks of life. YouTube celebrities, comedians, historians, even neighbors from the small mountain community that I live in. They're people who love history and get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not so distant past. The jumping off point is the place where they became curious, then entered the rabbit hole into discovery. Fueled by an unrelenting need to know more, we look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. Armchair Historians is an independent, commercial-free podcast. If you'd like to support the show and keep it ad-free, you can buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi, or you can become a patron through Patreon. Links to both in the episode notes. Hello, fellow armchair historians. Before we get into today's show, I'd like to take a moment to thank those who have supported the show over the past year. P.S. We just celebrated our 1-year anniversary. So, without further ado, a big heartfelt thank you to Mesa Pack, Tremors 8, Beverly Nix, Scott Greenberg, Edward Graham, Paul Boat, David Carroll, and last but of course not least, Ruth Rosenfeld. Your support means the world to us. If you would like to support the show, it's really easy. Just go to the website, armchairhistorians.com, and click on the Patreon link. For as little as $1 a month. For a one-time contribution of 1 or more cups of coffee, I say that in air quotes, use the Ko-fi link. In this episode of Armchair Historians, I'm thrilled to share with you the conversation I had with the Slave Dwelling Project founder, Joe McGill. The Slave Dwelling Project envisions a future in which the hearts and minds of Americans acknowledge a more truthful and inclusive narrative of the history of the nation, one that honors the contributions of all our people, one that is embedded and preserved in the buildings and artifacts of people of African heritage and inspires all Americans to acknowledge their ancestors. Now, one of the ways that Joe brings attention to his mission is he actually hosts sleepovers at intact slave dwellings throughout the United States. Joe has rolled out his sleeping bag at slave dwelling structures in 25 different states. Each sleepover begins with an often difficult dialogue led by Joe with his fellow campers, unpacking the truth about the history of the institution of slavery in the United States. Joe McGill, welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks for having me.
We just get right off into the races, and I'm going to ask that question. What is your favorite history that we're going to be talking about today?
My favorite history is antebellum, prior to the Civil War, and the institutional enslaving of people, the peculiar institution.
Okay. Tell us about the project that you're working on and how that relates to your favorite history.
The project that I work on is called the Slave Dwelling Project. We're in 11 years of sleeping in slave dwellings, finding slave dwellings wherever they are in these United States, and getting permission from the stewards to spend the night in these spaces with the goal of bringing attention to these spaces. Because, once upon a time you could come to sites where these spaces exist, but this space would not be the focal point of why you're there, or even a part of the narrative, because these slave dwellings held enslaved people. That's where they lived. And there was this concentrated effort in our past to minimize or eliminate that element of our history. So having contact with some of these places, working for the National Trust for Historic Preservation at the time, seeing that historic buildings could be saved and should be saved, I knew the know-how existed of how to save them. The resources to save them was also there. But what was lacking was the will and the desire for the people who could do the saving, or the will or the desire of those who would be on the receiving end of obtaining knowledge that they could disseminate. That desire was not as prevalent now. It was not as prevalent then
Mhm.
as it is now. And the slave dwelling project can take some of the credit for it gaining more attention, because there are more sites out there that are restoring these places, and above and beyond restoring the places, they are telling the stories of the people who inhabited those spaces.
So, okay, you go to these places, and from what I can tell, you stay in them, and you have groups of people that also stay there, and then do you have dialogue and conversations? Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, sleeping is easy. 11 years ago when I started this thing, it
Can
was
I just
just
stop
that
you for
simple.
a second?
Yes.
I just saw your shirt.
Yes.
I love your shirt.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I like my history. I like my history black.
Hold
Hold the
the
sugar.
sugar.
Yeah. This is
That's
this is one
brilliant.
of my creations. Yeah. And there are people throughout the U.S. who has one of these shirts. An idea that came out of this head, this cranium,
I love
just
it.
like just like the slave dwelling project.
Right.
Same idea. So yeah, the sleeping is easy. Anybody can do that. But the project has evolved from just sleeping. 11 years ago, I just wanted to sleep at these places because that brought attention. The question was to some, and still is, well, why? Why do you want to sleep in these places? And the fun part is telling them why. Well, the why is to bring attention to them, because that works. Because 11 years later, I'm still at this thing, and the evolution came when we went beyond the sleeping portion of what we do, and going beyond that sleeping portion is what we do are the conversations that we have before the sleepover, usually around a campfire, and it usually involves those topics that people don't generally talk about amongst people who don't look like them. We talk about slavery and the legacy that is left on this nation. Prior to COVID, such subject matters were, Confederate monuments, should they stay or should they go? Weddings on plantations, white supremacy, white privilege, historical trauma. We were talking about all those things and more. Well, then COVID hit. Because COVID hit, we had to adjust. And now I still go to these places, but I go alone and I give people access to the place through Zoom calls or Facebook Live. But just this past weekend, I went to Connecticut and I had my first sleepover with other people, um, more than a year. So yeah, that turned out nicely. So I should be writing a blog soon. It's been a year and some change, since I've written a blog, because the blogs that I write is based on the fact that not only have I stayed in the place overnight, but others have stayed in the place also. And I ask the participants, to contribute to the blog that I write. And it makes it a little more exciting. They want to know that, yeah, I've been to this place, I've slept in this place. But, by others contributing to that blog, it gives their angle of that sleepover also, gives it more than one voice.
I read somewhere that you've been to 25 different states and slept in quarters in 25 different states.
And the District of
Oh, there
Columbia.
you go.
So yeah, 25 states. Most of them are southern states, but there are northern states in there also, because slavery existed in northern states. And I usually get the most pushback when I tell people about what I do. And I tell them that I've taken this project to northern states because, in their minds, as was in my mind 11 years ago when I started this project, slavery was relegated to the South, plantations in the South. Well, just having that thought and that thought only, you miss a lot. I missed a lot. I missed the urban slavery right in Charleston, South Carolina. And I certainly missed the slavery that existed in northern states. You know, the thing about the slavery that existed in northern states is that the northern states started to abolish slavery shortly after the Revolutionary
Mhm.
War. So they did it legislatively. It took, of course, a civil war and the 13th Amendment to end slavery in southern states. But even when the slavery was ended in those northern states, there was still complicity. They were still complicit because they owned the banks, the insurance companies, the ships bringing them in, and the factories adding value to the cotton that was being picked in the
Mhm.
South.
We don't hear that story very often. Because when you said
Yeah,
Connecticut, I was surprised and I'm curious. So, where were you in Connecticut?
I was in New London and Suffield. New London, I've been going there up until COVID. I had gone there about 5 consecutive years, and then this year we picked it back up. You know, after COVID. But I also added Suffield to the this past weekend, which was quite exciting. Oftentimes that I go to a lot of these
Hmm.
sites, the audiences aren't that diverse. Diverse. It's
In
mostly white
Connecticut?
folks,
Yeah.
but that's okay. Yeah. Well, the Suffield
Oh,
event was mostly white folks. Now, the event that I go for in New London is diverse because it's Juneteenth. It's a Juneteenth commemoration. So we have a good mixed audience, good diverse audience in New London.
so what has been some of the results? What has been some of the positive and negative experiences that you've had since you've been doing this?
Mostly positive. The number of sites that are doing the right thing in the sense that they are telling some element of the stories of the people who were enslaved at those sites and telling them in a manner that's
Hmm.
satisfactory. They're not talking about the happy slaves or the benevolent
Hmm.
slave owners. That numbers of places doing that is increasing. There are also sites that are working now more with the descendants of those who were enslaved there. That's more of a challenge for sites because, some of them are afraid to go there because of that R word that's being tossed around a lot, reparations. Some of them don't want to go there because it's just all the bureaucracy that is involved in trying to do all that. It comes from the other way also. There are African Americans that don't want to set foot on a plantation because of all that it represented. So, there is that. I'm trying to, convince as many people that look like me that it is necessary for us, our faces, to be in the audience at these places because if we're not going to these places, why should a site care or why should a site be concerned about telling our part of the story when none of us are in the audience? Well, part of the reason that a lot of us are not in the audience is because of what the way things used to be. Those places were telling that romantic element of the story. They weren't telling the stories of the enslaved. They weren't telling the part of the story that makes people uncomfortable. They're talking about again magnolias and moonlight and hoop skirts and mint juleps and things of this nature. Our foreparents didn't want to go to those places to hear that. And now we're the offsprings of these people who are now capable of going to these places, and we are in a position to affect change and demand that these places, tell the
Hmm.
stories of our enslaved ancestors and tell it in a manner that's
What
respectful.
does that look like? Maybe you have an example of somebody who is telling that story and telling it appropriately.
Yeah. Well, that looks like a place that you can go to and yeah, you can hear about that nice, beautiful big house, but also include in that, well, who built it? Who physically built it? they weren't the architects, but who cut down that tree that's now that building, that axe mark that made that tree a beam now that holds that house up. All those axe marks, who those tool marks, who put those there? Who made those bricks that are now that house? Whose
Hmm.
fingerprint is
Yeah.
that in those bricks? If you look at the tax record that existed,
Hmm.
these people were property, and they paid taxes on them. You might be able to pull a name off of that record. Now, you look at the census information. They won't give them a
Yeah.
name, but they'll enumerate them, because they'll enumerate them because of for the purpose of congressional representation, and of course it's also necessary to enumerate them because you're paying taxes on them. If you're not paying taxes on an enslaved person, you got to prove that they ran away, they died, or you sold them. So you got to have records of that. And I'm saying all that to say this. A lot of those sites say that they don't tell the story because they don't have any evidence of their
Yeah.
existence. Well, they do. In all those forms, all those things that I just mentioned.
Hmm.
That's their existence. You look into those court records, look into those bankruptcies, look into those property records, because that's what they were, property. If you see
Yeah.
them doing an inventory, then that
Right.
means enslaved people are listed
And that's the
on
story.
those
Yeah. Yeah. I see
inventories.
what you're
And
saying. Yeah.
yeah,
A while back, I don't know whether it
yes,
was something I was watching or reading, but there's a slave quarter somewhere in the South, and they actually have, I don't know what you call it, but they would take like the how the owls cough up stuff, that, and they would actually
yeah,
look at that and
hmm
the content of it, and they would decipher the history through it of the people who inhabited the
well,
quarters, which I thought was fascinating.
yeah, they look,
Archaeologists.
archaeologists and archivists. They look
There you
for
go.
rats'
Yeah.
nest of of that period. They'll pull something away from a wall or a siding or whatever is that wall. They'll pull it away, and they see these rats' nests in there, and instead of just tossing them, they look through it meticulously, to see what information they could gather from there. There's strips of paper, sometimes strips of newspapers, or sometimes maybe a small metal object that's pertinent to that period in history. So yeah, archivists, that's what they do. And the wall itself, sometimes you're using
Oh, yeah.
newspaper for insulation. Now that would be a more modern period in our history, but still, that's still
Yeah.
valuable information.
Well, this is an obvious question. Why this history? Why this history? And when did you first learn about this history? Kind of like
Yeah,
that. When did you learn about it, and why this history for you?
yeah. Well, this history that that they taught me in school, South Carolina history, world history. It was a history that was a product of recent desegregation, our recent integration, where the schools were desegregated and integrated, but the curriculum was not. It was still that Gone with the Wind, hoop skirt, that version of history that was taught to me as a South Carolinian. Well, I had to purge my mind of all that,
Hmm.
because that history gave me nothing to really be proud of. Even in college, when I got out of the military and went to college after the military, the history, the necessary history that I had to take still wasn't that exciting to me, still wasn't that inspiring to me. But it was my summer job at Fort Sumter that I got while I was still in going to school that got me interested in history, because now I'm working at the fort where the Civil War started. So I had to immerse myself in history. In immersing myself in this history,
Hmm.
I'm learning a history now the way I should have learned history all along. Because now I'm learning about slavery, the fact that this nation was built on slavery. All the luxuries that these enslavers were afforded came at the expense of stolen labor. So now I'm learning about this in a manner that I should have known or should have learned about when it was first taught to me. So this history came about as a result of me getting the job at Fort Sumter and knowing that I had to be well versed and know what I was talking about, because now I'm in front of an audience disseminating history. And to do that, you got to at least know the history that you're disseminating. And of course, the slave dwelling project built on that. It also built on the fact that before the slave dwelling project came about, I was a Civil War reenactor. The Civil War reenacting came about because I saw the movie Glory, and at the time I started the Civil War group, I was a park ranger at Fort Sumter in Fort Moultrie, witnessing a lot of Confederate reenactors and having disdain for what I was witnessing because, in my mind, they were commemorating an era in history that enslaved my ancestors. For them to ask me to be a part of their organization, I thought was a slap in the face, because not that they were asking me to come and serve as a cook or anything of that nature. They wanted me to come and be a combatant in the Confederate Army, because they had taken the research that they had done at the time, and they saw that it might have been some black combatants in the Civil War, probably enough to count on one hand. But they took the fact that the Confederate Army was conscripting the enslaved people and had them in their ranks as cooks and hostlers, people who took care of horses and fixed wagons and dug and built the forts, who may, after the Civil War, had claimed a pension just based on that. Well, some of these researchers, or some of these guys who wanted that five to be more, they were kind of taking that in their minds, making it more, justifying the fact that there were blacks fighting for the Confederacy. So, they were trying to get me into
Mm,
their ranks to further that falsehood, the fact that they're taking this handful of combatants and trying to make them more than they were.
unbelievable.
And I was not about that in furthering their cause. So, I started the Civil War unit in Charleston, South Carolina. So I was building on this knowledge of Black history, and all this came together when I was working for the National Trust. I had the opportunity when I left the National Trust. I'm sorry, before I went to the National Trust, after I left the Park Service, after I left Penn Center, I went to I went to Iowa to build a museum, to oversee the building of a museum. And it was then I was asked to be a part of a History Channel documentary based on the fact that I was written about in a book called Confederates in the Attic by Tony Horowitz. And and because I was written about that, it was a book about reenactors. I got the opportunity to get a part in this documentary called The Unfinished Civil War, and that built on the knowledge and opportunities that I had. And while filming this documentary, the producer, wanted a little more substance for what he was portraying in this documentary. Of course, this documentary was just falling around Civil War reenactors and figuring out what made them tick. And he was looking for a little more substance for the documentary. And I told him about this crazy idea that I have had about
Oh,
sleeping in a slave cabin, and he made it happen. And he made that very first stay happen at Boone Hall Plantation in 1999. But see, at that time, I was doing it strictly for that purpose because it was a part of that documentary. Although my idea is still a part of that documentary, and I did it and I kind of left it alone. Well, in 2009, right around 2008, Magnolia, where I work now, they were restoring the cabins, and they brought in a team of experts to evaluate the work that was being done. Well, I was one of those team members that they brought in, and that idea, as we was looking at those cabins and inspecting those cabins, I dusted off that old idea and thought, hey, when they finish this, maybe I can spend the night. Well, I said it out loud, and whoever I said it out loud to took it up the chain, and they thought it was a great idea, and I thought, because they thought it was a great idea. I acquired a list from the State Historic Preservation Office of those places because it was easier for them to understand my intent because they're preservationists just like I am.
Yeah.
So
Right.
they provided me this list, and I started making phone calls based on this list I got from them. And the steward started to say, "Yes, come on, you can do this." And I made a list, and I started it in 2010. And 11 years later, 25 states later, in the District of Columbia, we're still at it.
Wow. So is this like a side job that you do?
Well, kind of like a full time. Yeah, it's like I got two full time jobs.
Okay.
Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. You could find me there Wednesday through Sundays. Wednesdays through Sundays when I'm not on one of my trips. Like last week, I was in Connecticut. Well, this week I go to Hilton Head Island in Galveston, Texas, for the commemoration of Juneteenth. And what better place to be than in Galveston, Texas, for Juneteenth? And the last weekend of this month, I go to the governor's mansion, the Virginia's governor's mansion, for a sleepover.
Wow. What would you like my listeners to know if they can know one thing about this history? What would you like to leave them with?
Yeah, it's a history that's necessary, especially now in these days and times. There's this effort afoot to quell this type of history, and it's political. We need not entertain that thought of not teaching the real history of this nation. We've been sugarcoating our history for far too long, and this
Mhm.
sugarcoating has gotten us to a place where some history is being minimized. It shouldn't be minimized. We talked about, it's written that we are the huddle masses, and the huddle mass means that there are many of us, many people who don't look like us in this nation, who don't worship like us in this nation, whose sexual preference is not that of the norm. These are people nonetheless. We need to coexist. If we are to form this perfect union, we gotta, let those who are not like us exist and not minimize them or their way of life, not make them the enemy. I found out in my time that I get along well with people who are well traveled because they think more broadly. They know that they're not the only people in the world, or their kind is not the only kind in the world. They think beyond that immediate area that some people live in. There's some people who are born in a place and die in that same place
Mhm.
with very little travel. There's this saying, and I know I'm going to butcher it. If you look at a tombstone, you see the day they're born and the date that they die. Then there's a dash. They said the content is in the dash. What did you do those times? Were you one of the ones that just stayed there? You were born in this place and you just died in this place? Are you one of those? Or are you one of the ones that broaden your horizon because you wanted to get beyond that place and go to other place and mingle with other people and coexist with other people? I want to be one of those who coexisted with other people and hopefully pave the way for others to coexist in this world. Also, guys, our conference is September 30th through October 2nd, Changing Narratives and Changing Times. We're going to be dealing with all these changes that are coming about, with the narrative. We've got a lot of statues coming down, a lot of Confederate monuments coming down. Aunt Jemima is no longer, Uncle Ben is no longer, Lady Antebellum is no longer, Dixie Chicks are now the Chicks. And we've got people kind of piling on, if you will, changing the names of a lot of places. And I'm not saying all this are good or bad, but I do know that we're going to be talking about it all at our upcoming conference.
Is it a virtual conference or in person?
Yeah, it is. It's virtual.
Oh, okay. And what's the name of it?
Changing narratives in changing times. Yeah, and you can find all that information on our website, slavedwellingproject.org.
Which I'll link out to all these on our episode notes. Was there anything else that I haven't asked you or that, you wanted to share?
Yeah, guys, we're gonna, as I stated, my first sleepover with others in over a year happened this past weekend at in Connecticut. We're going to be writing the blog in about 2 weeks, so hopefully we're getting to a place where we're comfortable enough to sleep with people that we don't know, which is interesting to me.
How does somebody get connected with the sleepover? How does that happen?
Yeah, you go on the website. It's all there.
Okay.
You can see our upcoming schedule, and they have these ways to link in with us. A lot of these opportunities will be through digital means.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate hearing about this project. I'll definitely follow it. Also, on the website, I assume there's some way that we can support the project, different ways that we can do that.
Yeah, there is that section. Yeah, please always visit that section on the website.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate your time.
You are welcome.
There you have it, Joe McGill and the Slave Dwelling Project. For more information about Joe McGill and the Slave Dwelling Project, be sure to check out our episode notes. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week.